Well, let's talk to the government now. I'm joined by the Security Minister, Dan Jarvis. Very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Why don't we start on the topic of Ukraine, since we just came off Mark's report there. I have an overarching question for you as a former soldier who, of course, served in Iraq. Does it make you uncomfortable, all of this kowtowing to President Putin? Are you someone that believes force has to be met with force?
I mean, I'd describe it as diplomacy. I'd describe it as the best strategy to try and get a peace settlement. It's in all of our interests, certainly the people of Ukraine, but certainly in our own national interest, to bring this terrible conflict in Ukraine to an end. I think the summit in Alaska was very helpful in terms of moving things forward. The Prime Minister chaired a meeting just the other day with 30 international leaders, the coalition of the willing. So it feels to me like we're closer than we've been at any point during the conflict. But we've got to drive that forward. We've got to get an agreement in place, and we've got to put in place a long-term, enduring peace settlement. That is obviously in the interests of Ukraine, of wider European security, but that is in our own national security interests as well.
Do you think, though, it's an element of putting pragmatism ahead of principle, ahead of your personal principles, for example?
Well, I think in situations such as this, you've got to be pragmatic. The loss of life in Ukraine is horrific. This is a conflict that has gone on for far too long. It needs to be brought to an end. Now, that is easy to say. It is difficult to do. Clearly, there's a pivotal role for the President of the United States in this. We need to work very closely with him, as we are. I think it was very significant to see the European leaders in the White House with President Zelensky, supporting him, having constructive conversations with President Trump. All of that is very positive, but we need to drive on and keep going with it. And I know that the Prime Minister is absolutely committed to ensuring that the UK plays its full part in that process.
On that very topic, I know there's moving parts as to exactly what will materialise, so I'm not precisely asking about that, but when it comes to the potential for boots on the ground in Ukraine, you obviously still have a lot of friends in the military. Is it something that your friends in the army are ready and willing to do if that becomes part of the security guarantee?
Well, obviously need to be very careful not to set any hairs running, and we're not at that point, and absolutely no decisions have been made. But your point is a good and a fair one. Clearly, those people who serve in our armed forces will be thinking about the situation in Ukraine, and both they and their families will be wondering about what that might bring in the future. We have to be incredibly mindful of that. We are extremely fortunate to have the best armed forces in the world. They are extremely capable. And the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary have been crystal clear that we want to play our part in ensuring that a long-term peace settlement is enforced for the longer term and provide the reassurance both to Ukraine but also the deterrence to Russia. So this feels to me like a pivotal moment. We are closer to peace than we've been at any point previously. And the UK government, the Prime Minister has been clear about this, will want to play our full part in terms of ensuring that we secure that peace.
Let's talk about migration. What are you announcing today?
Well, we've reached another deal with the government of Iraq. The government of Iraq are a key strategic ally in our work to combat irregular migration. Everybody has seen the very concerning scenes of significant levels of crossings across the English Channel, and we're working very hard to put a stop to that. The best way to do that is to work upstream of the problem, and there are a number of strategic partners that we're working very closely with. Clearly, the French and colleagues in Europe are an important part of the solution, but we also need to look further afield, and that's why the Home Secretary visited Iraq the back end of last year. That's why the Prime Minister met with the Prime Minister from Iraq earlier this year, and that's why just yesterday we've signed this agreement which will give us the ability to more rapidly repatriate people who've come here from Iraq. So it's part of a wider process of leveraging our diplomatic relations to ensure that it is not only much more difficult for people to get here illegally in the first place, but if they are able to do that, we've got the ability to return them much more quickly and much more effectively than was the case previously.
Can you return them immediately to Iraq if they came from Iraq?
Well, the basis of the agreement that we've signed yesterday makes that much easier. So this is a really good, positive move. We're very grateful to the cooperation that's been shown by the government of Iraq, but this is just a part of the jigsaw. And clearly we're working very closely with a range of other partners, as I say, in Europe, but in further afield. There's a lot of activity taking place by the National Crime Agency, disrupting the vile smuggling gangs that seek to bring people here in the first first place. So whilst this is a wicked problem that is incredibly challenging, we're pushing forward with diplomatic relationships with our partners internationally, and also through the National Crime Agency and through the use of other assets, doing everything that we possibly can to crack down on the smugglers who will seek to bring people here in the first place.
Obviously, it hasn't brought down the small boats numbers yet, and it brings me to the next topic, which is where illegal migrants are housed whilst they're claiming asylum. And no doubt you saw the decision around Epping Forest yesterday. Will the government appeal that decision?
Well, we'll see where we get to with that specific decision. We're looking very closely at it. I think it's important to understand the context that for many years there has been concern and there have been protests about that particular hotel in Epping. In fact, if you go back to 2022, Robert Jenrick was the minister then. I think for the second time he opened that hotel to asylum seekers, and there was talk of a legal challenge at that particular moment. So I understand why the District Council have brought forward a legal challenge. Clearly,
Sorry, is this Robert Jenrick's fault, or is it your fault that it's still being used as a hotel at the moment?
The point I'm making is that there is a long context to the use of this particular hotel, which goes back a number of years. There have been long-standing concerns about it. The bigger issue is how we can tackle the asylum backlog. We inherited a very significant backlog from the previous government, who effectively stopped processing asylum claims. That's why we re-diverted the resource that had been put in place for Rwanda to ensure that we can process asylum claims much more quickly than was previously the case. And I think the rate of processing is up by 116%. We've returned 35,000 people over the last year who don't have a right to be here. So yes, we need to drive down the use of hotels. The government has made a very clear commitment that hotels are not appropriate accommodation for asylum seekers. And by the end of this Parliament, we intend to have phased out their use altogether.
I guess, the question specifically, though, is on this injunction against the use of the Bell Hotel in Epping. Do you plan to appeal that? And, I'll show the Nigel Farage op-ed today in the Telegraph. He says your decision or not to appeal that decision will show which side of the debate the government is on. Is that a fair framing of this or not?
Well, I haven't read Mr Farage's op-ed, but I've always thought that the best politicians try and bring people together, and the very worst politicians try and drive them apart. We will look closely at the circumstances in Epping. We're looking at contingency options to accommodate those people who will now have to move out of that hotel. But the bigger problem is ensuring that we process asylum claims more quickly and more effectively than has been the case previously. And as I say, we've made very significant progress with doing that.
Where would they go if you don't? I mean, as you're saying, you're looking at contingency. So will it go to a different hotel?
Yeah. Well, the use of hotels is not a long-term sustainable arrangement. In this specific case, we'll have to look at contingency options for how those people can be accommodated in an alternative way. We've made the commitment to drive down the use of hotels. Under the previous government, there were 400 hotels in use. We're now down to just over 200. That is still too many, but we're looking very carefully at how we can drive down the use of hotels even further. And as I say, we've made a commitment that we'll drive it down to zero by the end of this Parliament.
Very, very interesting on all of those numbers. We have to move on just because we're sort of out of time, but I wanted to ask your reflection on the inflation number. 3.8% for the month of July. Of course, May was 3.4, June was 3.6. It's a trend that you must be a little worried about?
Yeah, I mean, the Chancellor has responded. I think there is more positive economic data that we can look at in terms of the level of growth set against other G7 countries. But clearly, economic growth is the absolute priority. The Chancellor, the government have invested a huge amount of time in trying to fix the fundamentals of our economy. That is a process that is underway. There'll be a budget in the autumn. But clearly, it is an absolute priority for us to ensure that we've got economic growth in our country. That's how we're going to pay for the public services that we want to deliver for the country.
But on 3.8% inflation, it's almost double what the Bank of England's forecast is. Is it not getting into areas that causes a serious concern?
Yeah, it's a disappointing number, but the government is absolutely committed to ensure that we have economic growth that, as I say, can fund the public services that we are ambitious to provide for the country. I think we've seen a lot of positive economic indicators over recent times. Nobody is complacent in this government, not least the Chancellor, about the scale of the challenge. It's an absolute priority for our government because, as I say, we're not going to be able to do the ambitious things that we want to do for the country without the economic growth that we need to see. So it's an absolute priority, I know, for the Chancellor and for the whole of the government.